And
Senator,
has my time expired?
I'm afraid it is.
My apologies. My clock is doesn't run when I'm remote, and I will yield my non-existent remaining time. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Graham.
Thank you. To my dear friend, Sheldon, I appreciate your consistency. So what would account for the elephant herd is apparently marching in one way. H.R. 1, I believe, is supported by most every liberal group in the country. Most of my Democratic colleagues support H.R. 1. Why? What motivates you? Redistricting. Under your proposal, you would take redistricting away from state elected officials and give it to some independent commission. What's that got to do with voting? That's about trying to change the ability of red states to be able to draw new lines based on population shift. H.R. 1 has a 6-to-1 match for low dollar donations. What's that got to do with voting? Nothing. It's got to do with political power, trying to have the federal government subsidize campaigns favorable to you. And if 6-to-1 match had been in place in my recent election, South Carolina would have probably had over $1 billion spent. I think the people of South Carolina deserve better than that. I raised 110. My opponent raised 132. If you had a 6-to-1 match, it'd have been about $1 billion. I think that's cruel and probably violates the Geneva Convention. So H.R. 1 is not about righting wrongs. It's about power. It's about trying to grab power, and I can understand why people want to grab it. I don't understand why people on our side would willingly sit on the sidelines, and we're not. But we're here today to talk about the voting process. Mr. Gardner, you're sort of a legend in your part of the world. I think rightly so. It's my understanding that you oppose H.R. 1 in the Senate equivalent. Is that correct?
Yes.
In 30 seconds or less, why?
Well, first of all, we don't have any early voting in New Hampshire. And for all the studies that show that early voting actually helps turnout, I can show you plenty of academic studies that show the opposite. That just because you make voting easier does not raise the turnout automatically. And we have election day that is a day for everything in New Hampshire. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Our Constitution predated the federal Constitution, and it ends that day. It's our tradition because every polling place, the chief election officer has to, that evening of the election, read publicly the votes cast for every candidate on the ballot, and that is the end of it. And our early voting, that what is called early voting across the country, is just not allowed under our Constitution.
So you believe that it would be a power grab when it came to New Hampshire voting? Is that fair to say? By the federal government?
Yes. And the same thing with no fault absentee.
Okay.
We didn't even know, it's the same thing.
Thank you very much. The Carter-Baker Commission looked at voter fraud in voting in 2008. They found that there's no evidence of extensive fraud in U.S. elections or multiple voting, but both occur and it could affect the outcome of close elections and many other findings. The absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. That's what the Carter-Baker Commission said, not me. The Carter-Baker report said, recommend to reduce fraud, recommend prohibiting third-party organization candidates and political party activists from handling absentee ballots. I think that's related to ballot harvesting. So my question for Ms. Abrams, do you support voter identification laws?
Yes.
Okay. Do you
There
support...
are 35 states in the United States that have had voter identification laws.
Okay.
In fact, every state requires some form of identification. What
Okay.
I have objected to is restrictive voter identification laws
So-
that narrow the set of permissible materials that allow you to prove
The
your
answer
identity.
the answer is yes, as a concept. Do you support the idea that voting should be limited to American citizens?
Yes.
Do you support that we should have, do you support ballot harvesting? Are you familiar with that term?
I'm familiar with the term of art that's been propagated to describe a variety of efforts. But for example, on Native American reservations where they are precluded from access due to underfunding to reach in a timely fashion locations for voting, I do believe that it's appropriate for tribal elders to collect the ballots and retrieve them and use a single source of delivery to provide those ballots and thus provide Native Americans with the opportunity to participate in elections.
Do you,
I think
do you support it beyond Native American voting?
as I've said, I believe that it depends on the situation and that the term of art that is being used describes a variety of behaviors, and each of those behaviors should be examined for utility and for veracity. And to the extent that they help voters participate in elections in a lawful manner, they should be permitted.
Okay. Do you believe the Republican majority in Georgia, House, Senate, when they are making the changes to your state voting laws, do you think they're motivated by trying to suppress the African American vote?
I have seen it happen sometimes that they are. I've seen other bills that have been truly bipartisan in nature that have looked at and fully examined.
But you believe
and
that's the
actually taken into
motivation
consideration.
behind, do you believe that's
I'm
the
sorry, sir?
motivation behind these laws?
I believe the motivation behind certain provisions in SB 202 are a direct result to the increased participation of communities of color in the 2020 and 2021 elections. I have participated for 11 years. As Speaker Pro Tem Jones pointed out, we served together, and almost every year there was a voting law. And when those voting laws were neutral, not only on their face,
Well,
but in
I'm
their,
out of time. Do you
I would
think,
support
do you
it.
think the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pro Tem, the lady, Jan Jones, is motivated by trying to limit the African American voters in Georgia? Do you think
I
that's,
believe there is racial animus that generated those bills. I would not assume that that racial animus is shared by every person, but
Thank
if
you.
the result is that racial animus exists and it eliminates access to the right to vote, then regardless of a certain person's heart, if the effect is deleterious to the ability of people of color to participate in elections, then that is problematic and that is wrong and it should be rejected by all.
Senator Klobuchar?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I'm just looking at the facts, and I think that we need to get these facts straight. In the 2020 election, more than 160 million
Do you look at
Americans.
any other states for guidance or inspiration in the provisions of SB 202?
Yes, sir, we most certainly did. We wanted to make sure that although our voting system is more expansive than many in the country, particularly in the Northeast, we wanted to make sure that any changes we made were mainstream, common sense, and made it easier, more fair, more transparent, and secure for a voter, regardless of their geography or whichever party they tended to vote for. And I do believe this bill does that. We, unlike, frankly, most states in the union, we do have a voter ID, which is common sense regulation and required to pick up a child from daycare, board a flight to go visit grandmother. It's to cash a check. And I think the bigger issue for the 3% who do not currently have a either driver's license or a free, and I emphasize free voter ID, I'm most concerned about their ability to participate in the 21st modern century and society as a whole. And that's perhaps where we should give our efforts to, is not undermine the security of elections for absentee ballots, but rather help the few that don't have one to obtain one. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Also to you, Speaker Jones, can you tell me what SB 202 does to reduce lines at vote? And if it's got 10 examples that you can give me just one or two.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Because particularly in the June primary, when we had a brand new election system, elections officials, poll workers were learning how to utilize the machines. We did have some long lines in some areas of the state. They were primarily in counties that are Democrat run. But regardless of that, what we did was we have required that at any single point in time in the next general election, if there is a line of 1 hour or longer, at the next following subsequent general election, the election superintendent for that county must either split the precinct, add poll workers, add machines, or all of the three.
I'd like to ask Senator or Secretary Gardner, Iowa and New Hampshire brag about first in the nation, one for caucus, one for primary. In fact, we're HR 1 or its state equivalent, S1, is passed. If so, what effect do you think that would have on the ability of our states to preserve their first in the nation status?
Senator, S1 would not specifically have an effect. However, I've made the statement that it could put the New Hampshire primary in a perilous position. And I stand by that statement.
Okay. Let me ask you one other question. Your state has voting laws that are seen as restrictive, yet as you told us in your opening statement, it's consistent that consistently has some of the highest turnout elections in the country. Would you agree with me that voters tend to turn out more for elections when they have more confidence that their vote will be counted appropriately? And what effect has your voter ID provision had on turnout?
Absolutely. The trust and confidence voters have in the process is a huge boost to turnout. And New Hampshire had a voter ID law for the first in the 2012 presidential election. And so 2020, 6 months ago, that was the third presidential election that we had voter ID. We had in 2012 the highest turnout since 1960 in New Hampshire, over 14% higher than the country as a whole, and higher than we had had in over a half a century among our own presidential elections. In 2012, in 2016, we even went higher than that, 14.5% higher than the country as a whole, with the second presidential election using voter ID. And 2020, it was the same. When voter ID was going through the legislature, there were people saying that 10% of the population was not going to be able to vote. This would hurt certain groups more than it would hurt other groups. And there were polls that nonprofits like Pew published and came and testified in our hearings saying that it could be 11% decline. And in our state, it was just the absolute opposite. As I said, 3 presidential elections in a row, averaging, you have to go back a half a century. So those are the facts on that issue in New Hampshire.
But thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate having today's hearing. Unless you want to hand me the gavel, but I'm guessing not.
Keep hope alive. Yes.
Let me dive in the short time I have. We heard a couple folks speak in their opening remarks regarding equal implementation. I think it's an important topic to bring up. And I think we've actually seen in other areas where photo ID is used, equal implementation being an issue, but also being addressed. In fact, every time I go through TSA, to the best of my knowledge, every single person has to show their ID. In fact, I grabbed a six-pack of beer at Walmart the other day. The cashier recognized me, said, "Hello, Brian," and then asked for my ID. In the state of Wisconsin, every single person is asked for their ID, I think in part to remove any sort of disproportionate impact to any given group of individuals. It seems like a reasonably straightforward solution to address some of the challenges that may have been brought up in some of those opening comments. I think the private sector has addressed that. And I think it's maybe something other states outside of the state of Wisconsin might want to look at. Let me dive in to Ms. Lori Roman, if I can. Do you believe voter ID increases confidence in the integrity of the election process?
Yes, and I believe one of the other presenters presented that Americans overwhelmingly agree with it, of all ethnicities. So it increases integrity, and it also ensures that every single person's vote is not diluted by fraudulent votes. So every person of every ethnicity should desire to not have their vote diluted by a fraudulent vote.
Let me follow up. In your testimony, you quote from a Yale Law and Policy Review article authored by the former Ohio Secretary of State. In that, he said discriminatory intent is the key determination for voter ID laws. In your opinion, do voter ID laws have a discriminatory intent?
No, if applied, as you indicated, if applied to everyone, and without any subcategories, the Supreme Court has already looked at this. So in 2008, plurality of the Supreme Court asserted that if a state's burdens on voting are merely inconvenient, and if its restrictions are not discriminatory, those burdens are evaluated in such a way to defer to the policymaker's judgment.
Thank you. I'm gonna jump now over to Dr. Nazita Lejavardi, if I can, for a moment. Two of your studies use self-reported data about the impact of voter ID on the propensity to vote. Yet there's been other studies using actual turnout data that have found that there was not a difference in turnout in states based on voter ID. Would your data, do you think, have been different if you had used empirical data rather than self-reported information?
Thank you for that question and for giving me a chance to respond. So our first two studies looked at survey data from a nationally representative.
And I don't want to be rude. You can add things into the record, but I'm limited I got 90 seconds left.
Sure,
do you think it would have been different? Yes or no?
So our third study did show the same effect, and that was based on aggregate levels.
So in your opinion, you don't think it would have been different if self-reported to the empirical data. The second question. So in your third study, you looked at turnout changes between 2012 and 2016 in 4 states, and according to your testimony, it compared racially diverse counties in those states against majority white counties. Your study compared voter turnout in racially diverse counties in those 4 states to racially diverse counties in states that did not implement strict voter ID laws, and how they would compare. Question, in your analysis and in your model, did your study take into effect variables that could affect turnout, and in particular, such as having a historically bad candidate like Hillary Clinton?
That was not a variable that we controlled for, but we did control for other statewide covariates that might have been.
So you did not control for the difference maybe between a Barack Obama and, in my opinion, a historically bad candidate like Hillary Clinton on the impact of minority voter turnout?
We simply just looked at the differences in voter turnout in those counties in 2012 and in 2016.
I will not declare that I have a PhD in statistics, but I can tell you from an empirical data standpoint, just walking around and talking to people in many of these types of communities, that might very well be a worthwhile thing to look to see if you can control for, because I think it's going to show up in the empirical data. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, looking at the time, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, and I will yield back.
Ms. Paris, as I look at your career, I see the career of someone who has been an activist, and I believe a radical activist. You have waged litigation campaigns and opposed voter ID laws. You have opposed voter integrity laws. You have opposed prohibitions on ballot harvesting. You have advocated for felons being able to vote. As I look at your record year after year after year of being an extreme partisan advocate, I'm left with the very likely conclusion that if you were confirmed to the bench, you would likewise be a radical activist on the bench. Voter ID laws, as Senator Lee just pointed out, you described as the greatest rollback of voting rights in this country. 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. 60% of African Americans support voter ID laws. Do you believe voter ID laws are constitutional?
Senator Cruz, the Supreme Court has said that there are no per se restrictions against voter ID laws in Crawford.
I asked what you believe. I was one of the parties litigating in Crawford, so I'm very well familiar with that case and led a coalition of states defending voter ID laws, and Justice Stevens wrote the majority opinion upholding Indiana's voter ID law. My question to you is, do you believe voter ID laws are constitutional?
Senator, I believe they are constitutional. I believe that they can be constitutional because the Supreme Court has said they can be constitutional, and in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court gets to decide. That is what our system depends on. We have a concept of vertical stare decisis. We have rules of law. We have precedent.
Ms. Paris, just a couple of months ago, in March of 2021, you said that the voter ID laws that had been passed were due to, I'm going to quote you to get your words right, anxiety over the browning of America, and people having anxiety of the fact that certain folks in power are not going to be able to stay in power. Do you believe the 80% of Americans who support voter ID laws and the 60% of African Americans who support voter ID laws are doing so because they're concerned about the browning of America?
Senator, that quote is clearly referring to politicians. It's not referring to African Americans.
Which politicians here do you believe are concerned about the browning of America?
Senator, that context was with respect to state politicians.
So it's only state politicians?
Senator, that context that I'm on record for, we're referring to state politicians.
All right, well, let's talk about politicians here in this body. As you know, I filed an amicus brief on behalf of 11 senators in the Brnovich case. You made a comment that the brief that I filed was outrageous and harmful. Do you stand by that characterization?
Senator, the Supreme Court, as you know, issued its decision in the Brnovich case and struck down, and upheld the restrictions on Arizona.
Okay, I'd like you to answer my question. Do you stand by the characterization that the amicus brief that I filed on behalf of 11 senators was, quote, outrageous and harmful? That's how you characterized it.
Senator, the Supreme Court has issued its ruling on
I'm going to
Brnovich.
try again. Do you stand by your characterization? I'm not asking you what the Supreme Court did. You described an amicus brief filed on behalf of 11 senators as outrageous and harmful. Do you stand by what you said just a few months ago?
Senator, what I said as an advocate when it was pending before the court is not relevant to the issue before you.
Do you stand by it or do you retract it? You have a choice.
Senator, as an advocate, I pursue.
Okay, you're going to refuse to answer me on that. I assume you also believe the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision agreeing with the position advocated in my amicus brief. I assume you believe that decision was also outrageous and harmful because that's the language you used.
Senator, the Brnovich case is the law of the land. It has been settled.
So you're not going to answer that either?
The law of the land has been settled. What I am going to say, Senator, is that I am pledging to apply precedent.
So at the time, you discussed the brief filed by a number of senators on this committee as outrageous and harmful. At that time, had you had any discussions with the Biden administration about being nominated to be a judge?
I would need to remember the timing a little bit.
When was the first discussion you had with the Biden administration about being nominated to be a judge?
I would need to reference my Senate Judiciary questionnaire because that's where I recorded it. I don't have it committed to memory.
So you have advocated that felons should be able to vote. Do you believe all felons should vote?
Senator, my work and advocacy has been on behalf of persons who are living and working in the community.
Do you believe currently incarcerated prisoners in jail should be allowed to vote?
Senator, I have been advocating on behalf of people who are...
You're not answering my question. I didn't ask what you've advocated in the past. I'm asking what you believe.
Senator, the canons of judicial ethics preclude me from answering that question because a situation may come before me.
So let me ask you this. You have advocated in favor of a living constitution, and indeed, as both Senator Hawley and Senator Lee asked you about, you have disparaged those who believe in originalism as essentially racist and bigots. How do you think you will be able to serve with colleagues on the Court of Appeals if you have disparaged their constitutional interpretation as racist and bigoted? And secondly, why is it that when you advocate a, quote, living constitution, that somehow the livingness of it always makes the Constitution agree with the policy positions you happen to embrace? How is that consistent with democracy, to have a judge able to implement whatever policy positions you believe in?
Senator, we have had more than 24 amendments added to the Constitution since it was ratified in 1788.
But that's not what a living constitution is. A living constitution means you as a judge, if you're a judge, can change it to whatever you want, and that the voters don't get to speak on it. Isn't that right?
Senator, women now have the right to vote.
We passed an amendment for that. That's a terrific victory, and it was done the right way through an amendment. A living constitution is judges changing it. Why is judges changing the Constitution to meet their policy preferences consistent with any respect for the democratic process and the ability of voters to decide policy issues?
Senator, it is clear that our great Constitution is one that is enduring. It is clear with things like Brown versus Board overruling Plessy versus Ferguson that evolution happens. It is also clear that our great Constitution establishes separation of powers. There are bodies like this one that engage in policymaking. There are judges that review the cases and controversies that are put before them. I am pledging, by accepting this nomination, that I am going to cease being an advocate, and I would impartially, without reservation, objectively apply the law to the facts of the case and controversy before me.
Well, your record is overwhelmingly to the contrary.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perez, I watched some of the hearing on television earlier. I apologize. I missed Senator Hawley's question because I was on the floor voting. I just want to return to some of the things he said. My crack staff gave me a summary, but I assume it must be incorrect. Was it your testimony that Brown v. Board was correctly decided?
Yes.
Was it your testimony that you cannot say whether Shelby County and Brnovich are correctly decided?
Senator, there's an important distinction that if you will give me a moment of your time, I'd be happy to explain, but that is accurate.
So was Roe v. Wade correctly decided?
Senator, it is the law of the land and I would apply it.
Was Lochner correctly decided?
Senator, it is not really the law of the land anymore, but if I had been confirmed during that period, I would have applied it.
Was Dred Scott correctly decided?
Senator, it is...
Surely you can say Dred Scott was incorrectly decided.
Senator, it was incorrectly decided.
So what's the distinguishing line of cases you will say is correctly decided and cases you won't say? Because it seems like you're willing to say that they're correctly decided if you like them, but if you don't like them, you can't comment on it.
Senator, I do appreciate the question, and I think it is important, and I want to clarify this. As a judicial nominee, I am bound by the Code of Ethics to ensure that any prospective litigant before me knows that they are getting an impartial and fair hearing where they will not be prejudged, where they will be given the opportunity to present their case. I think that it will not happen that a case of the permissibility of de jure segregation in schools would make its way before me. And as such, I am comfortable that I would not be violating my code of ethics by commenting on it. There are a handful of other cases that may be true. Loving is probably one of them, Marbury versus Madison. Everything else, I would be very, very reluctant to give a potential litigant the wrong impression that they will not get a fair day in court.
What about abortion? That's a live issue in the courts.
And I am not...
You're not going to say whether Roe v. Wade was correctly decided?
That is correct.
Okay. Well, you've certainly had a lot of harsh things to say in the past about cases like Shelby and Brnovich and some of the issues that were adjudicated there. In fact, we just got notice last night about this article that just was published that you wrote. title of it is the GOP campaign to make elections less free. You noted in the letter you sent with the article that you did not see or approve of the title before it was published.
That is correct,
Which
sir.
I can understand. Authors don't choose their own titles. I understand that. You didn't say whether you agree with it. Do you believe the GOP is campaigning to make elections less free?
Senator, the entire piece does not mention any political party, and that is because I am an advocate for the right to vote, and I would criticize any politician who would impede that right, irrespective of their political party.
Do you think requiring photo ID is an impediment to vote?
Senator, the Supreme Court in Crawford said that voter ID laws were not per se unconstitutional. However, a Fifth Circuit en banc said that a particular voter ID law was illegal. This is a case-by-case inquiry where we are fortunate enough to have precedent that I would apply faithfully and without reservation.
I know that I think Senator Durbin said this article sounded like a speech he would give on the Senate floor. I agree. I don't think it proves the point you may have been trying to prove, though, Senator Durbin. Ms. Perez, you live in the New York City area?
I live in Jersey City.
Okay. How'd you get down here?
I took the Amtrak.
Okay. Did you have to show an ID to get your ticket or get on the Amtrak?
I don't believe so, sir.
Okay. Last time you flew, did you have to show an ID?
I did, sir.
Do you think that's an unfair restriction on your ability to travel?
That is the policy, and I am a rule follower, and I'm happy to abide by it because I can.
Okay. If someone commits a murder, do you think it's fair to call them a murderer?
If someone has been convicted
Oh, yeah,
for
convicted,
murder
yes.
under, yes.
If they commit rape, do you think it's fair to call them a rapist?
Have they been convicted?
convicted.
Yes, yes.
So if they commit a felon, do you think it's fair to call them a felon?
I think that that is a bit different because there's a temporal issue, and I think that there's a raging policy debate on that.
Because in the past, you've said that you don't like to use that word. Like you said, I don't use words like felons to describe people. I mean, we don't describe people by a mistake that they made.
I don't. I believe that every person is a child of God capable of being redeemed, and I never look at anybody and see the worst thing that they've ever done.
If those convicted murderers or rapists get released from prison, often under misguided policies, do you think it's still fair to call them a murderer or a rapist?
Irrespective of what their label was, sir, I would be on record as an advocate of trying to advocate for their right to vote if the criminal justice system had deemed them to be fit to be living amongst us.
All right, thanks for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Congratulations to you all. Mr. Olson, I remember when you used to come brief Congress as the director of the NCTC, and I always found you to be a sober, reasonable national security professional. Like I say, when Joe Biden nominated you to this position, I thought that was one of his better choices. But then I started looking at what you've been up to for the last 4 years, and now I have questions about which Matt Olson we're getting. 2017, you wrote an op-ed entitled, "The Electoral College is a National Security Threat." I want to repeat that. The Electoral College is a national security threat. Do you still believe that the Electoral College is a national security threat?
Well, Senator, let me begin by thanking you for your initial comments about my time as the National Counterterrorism Center Director. And I spent my better part of my career as a government public servant protecting the country. I left the government in 2014 and entered as the private sector. I wanted to remain engaged on the issues that I thought were important. And as a private citizen, of course, I expressed some views, including that article you're referring to, in a way that I wouldn't and haven't expressed as a public or government servant. That view, yes, there are aspects in context, if I may explain, there are aspects of the way in which the Electoral College allowed or could allow nefarious cyber actors to pinpoint their efforts to influence an election. There are ways in which the Electoral College makes us more vulnerable to nefarious, particularly nation-state cyber actors to influence elections. And that was what I was seeking to highlight.
I'm sorry.
No, of course.
Our time is very limited here. So you still think the Electoral College is a national security threat?
I stand by the content of the article that I wrote. Yes.
Should the Department of Justice ever bring a lawsuit to try to force states to, say, adopt the National Popular Voter Compact?
Senator, I'm not familiar with any statutory provisions or proposals along those lines.
Last year, in the middle of riots that caused billions of dollars of damage and had murders spiking at rates not seen in a generation, you described the situation as mostly peaceful protests. Do you think the rioting we saw last year was mostly peaceful protests?
I think that I'm not sure exactly the comment you're referring to, but I.
You signed a public letter last June saying that.
Yeah, I will say this, Senator. If I'm confirmed and have the opportunity to lead the National Security Division, the threat that we face from the types of violence that we've seen from the past several years, particularly any type of domestic terrorism, I would be responsible for enforcing our laws and enforcing those laws regardless of ideology and enforcing them fairly and impartially. And that would be my pledge.
You once wrote that ISIS supports Donald Trump. You think that ISIS supported Donald Trump?
I appreciate, again, Senator, the article you're referring to. Again, as a private citizen, I tried to stay engaged on the national security issues that I had worked on. And I will answer your question directly. The article I wrote was based on statements that I had seen that I was very concerned about from a propaganda standpoint. In 2016, when I wrote that article, ISIS had risen and was using its propaganda machine to influence people in the United States, and they were using the language, the words of then candidate Donald Trump to advance their propaganda machine. And so I was referring to their exact words in making that statement. And I stand by the article. I was concerned about the ways in which ISIS was using those comments to recruit and mobilize people in the United States.
If it's true that ISIS supported Donald Trump, do you think Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi thinks he made a bad bet?
I'm very supportive of the nature in which we prosecuted and the way the Trump administration took the fight to ISIS over the past several years.
Okay. So, Mr. Olson, I'll just say again, I had a lot of respect for the Matt Olson we saw as the NCTC director, but I feel like something has changed here. Just in the last 4 years, to review what we've covered today, you've said ISIS supports Donald Trump. You referred to rioting last summer as mostly peaceful protests. You've said the Electoral College is a national security threat. It's one thing to leave government, comment on public affairs, to even be partisan, to give money to candidates of your choice and to campaign for them. But I feel like something about Donald Trump's presidency in the last 4 years sent you a little bit around the bend. So it makes me wonder which Matt Olson we're going to be getting at the Department of Justice. My time's expired.
Representative Nancy Mace for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Ms. Thompson. I was a state lawmaker for 3 years before I came to Congress. I represent the 1st Congressional District of South Carolina, and South Carolina has had its own history, very bad history with Black South Carolinians, Black and Brown and African Americans. I recently took a vote to move statues like Supreme Court Justice Taney, removing his bust out of the Capitol Rotunda because he wrote the Dred Scott opinion, the one that said that Black and Brown and African Americans could not become citizens of the United States of America. I voted to move, someone like Wade Hampton, who encouraged the murder of over 150 Black South Carolinians during his run for governor. And so I appreciate your comments about the 60s. I was not around then, but I've watched and read a lot of the history and seen the videos and seen the moments of violence against Black America. So I applaud your work on that. My understanding is you were elected in 1972 in Texas. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right, and I applaud you for making history, I imagine, in Texas and being a strong voice for Black men and Black women. Coming from South Carolina, we've got voter ID. And I'm assuming Texas is the same way. Do y'all need IDs to buy alcohol when you're purchasing at the store?
Yes, to be sure that you are capable of doing that.
Right. Do you need an ID in Texas to buy cigarettes?
You can't buy them unless you're at least 21.
But do you have to show an ID to buy cigarettes?
You do have to show an ID.
Do you need an ID when you're getting a job and trying to get on payroll in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID to go to the pharmacy and get a prescription in Texas?
It depends on the prescription.
But do you need an ID for some prescriptions
Yes,
in
you do.
Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID to get Social Security services in Texas?
You do.
Do you need an ID to rent an apartment in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID if you're going to buy a house and finance it via a mortgage in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas if you're going to board an aircraft and fly commercial?
Yes.
Did you fly commercial or fly a private jet on the way to DC?
A chartered plane.
Do you have to show an ID when you fly in a private charter jet?
Yes.
I wouldn't know. I've never flown on one. So, did you need an ID to get in the building here today?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas to open a bank account?
Yes.
To cash your check if you're working. Do you know, Representative Thompson, what percentage of blacks in Texas, black and brown African Americans, are registered to vote?
Oh, a huge percentage.
70%. Do you know what percentage of African Americans, black and brown Texans, have voted on average or in the last election?
About 64%.
Correct. Do you know how many whites are registered to vote in Texas?
Far more than African Americans.
72%. You have 70% of blacks in Texas who are registered to vote. You have 72% of whites in Texas who are registered to vote. Do you know the percentage of whites who turned out to vote in recent elections?
I want to say over 50-some percent.
65%. Yeah. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics are registered to vote in Texas?
No, I do not.
63%. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics voted in the last election?
I think it was over 40%.
53%. Hispanics are not voting in as high numbers as blacks and whites in Texas. Do you know the percentage of Democrats that support voter ID?
Would you repeat your question?
Do you know the number or percentage of Democrats who support voter ID in this country?
I do not, but I don't think it's a whole lot.
72%. Do you know the number of black and brown and African Americans in this country who support voter ID?
No.
75%. Do you know the number of Hispanics that support voter ID in this country?
No.
81%. Do you know where the state of Texas is ranked with black voter turnout in this country?
With black voters turnout?
Mm-hmm. Do you know where Texas is ranked?
Oh, about 44%.
The latest numbers that I read this morning was that Texas is ranked 10th. Do you know where Texas is ranked? So then top 10 in the country. Do you know where Texas is ranked with women voters?
Oh, way up in the 50s.
In the bottom third of this country. So I would argue that Texas has a more difficult problem with getting women out to vote than black and brown and African Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Congresswoman Robin Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with a question for each of the 5 witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent,
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tolson. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's 2. Mr. Science?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about in practice? In intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist?
If the law that requires you to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
What about the
under
effect?
our
Set aside
Constitution.
intent. Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Yes, in effect, I
Okay,
think that
Ms.
there are
Reardon.
discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reardon.
I'm going to give the witness a chance to answer the question. Go ahead, Mr. Sines.
Yes, in effects, I think many voter ID laws are discriminatory, and in design. They are designed to have that effect.
Okay, Ms. Reardon.
No, sir.
Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this range of question actually shows the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all three of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated, are racist. So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws. And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying, if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now, DOJ has also said, under the Biden administration, that it is not going to presume that a state acts lawfully if it simply returns to pre-COVID voting laws. Ms. Reardon, Mr. Van Spakovsky, what does that tell you if they say after a pandemic, if you go back to the laws that existed before, DOJ is not going to assume that that's okay? What does that tell you about the partisan nature of DOJ?
By issuing the guidance that they did, it says to me that what they would like to do is make permanent the emergency procedures that were instituted by many states through litigation by the DNC throughout the country prior to the 2020 election. And they would like those to be permanent. And so rather than understand that they are temporary, they are going to go after states that design to go back to their original election procedures.
Well, and I think they also think Democrats did well under those emergency procedures, and so keeping those emergency procedures in place will predictably benefit Democrats. You know, I would note, in addition to disagreeing with the vast majority of the American people, the Democratic witnesses and the Democrats here also disagree with the United States Supreme Court. When I was the Solicitor General of Texas, I represented a coalition of states defending Indiana's voter ID law. Before the U.S. Supreme Court, a group of plaintiffs challenged that. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, upheld Indiana's voter ID law. Not only did they do so, Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the lions of the left, wrote the majority opinion where he said voter ID laws protect the integrity of elections. And yet, sadly, too many Democrats today don't want to protect the integrity of elections. And I've got to say there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal. One of the sad realities of today's Democratic Party is they define race as follows. If you're a Democrat, you qualify. So under the Democratic view, I'm not Hispanic. Senator Padilla is. If you're a Democrat, you're an Hispanic. My abuelo and abuela would be very surprised to discover I wasn't Hispanic. But that's how Democrat views it. That's how the radicals in the civil rights division view it. And I will point out as an example, this committee, one federal district judge in the state of Texas, Jason Pulliam, is an African-American judge nominated by President Trump, sat at this table, presented superbly. The Democrats had no criticism, and every single Democrat on this committee voted against him. Why? Because they perceived him as a black Republican. He didn't qualify as a black man. And I actually asked, as the Democrats were voting against Judge Pulliam, do you have one basis to vote against him? Anything you disagree with? None of them had any single answer at all. This hearing's about one thing. It's about power, and it's about ensuring Democrats stay in power. That's cynical, and it's at the expense of democracy and the right of voters to express their will through free and fair elections.
I'm going to ask my questions now and just begin by saying this hearing has nothing to do with any geographic discrimination, any idea that one state or another is oafish.
Some of our witnesses suggest, and some of our members seem to agree, at least in part, that requiring of an identification form, a photo ID, is somehow racially discriminatory. Raises all sorts of questions in my mind. Is our entire healthcare system racist? Are pharmacies racist? The airline industry, is that racist? The TSA? What about bars? You go into a bar? I mean, some people consider a form of flattery, I guess, if they get carded, but, you know, it happens, and they're required to ask for IDs. Many of them do as a matter of policy. But universities. One thing I've learned about all colleges and universities these days, they all issue a student ID, and they have photos on them. Make sure that the privileges associated with that university aren't being used improperly by someone else. What about Major League Baseball, the NFL, or all other event organizers who require you to show an ID when you go to pick up your tickets? Are they all racist? That would be news to me. It's certainly not racist to require someone to prove who they are in order to gain access to government benefits of one sort or another. It's never been deemed such. So why all of a sudden are we calling it that when people are just wanting to vote? Now some people will say on the other side is, oh, well, this is different. It's the right to vote. We've got to have as many people voting as possible. Well, hang on just a minute. If you don't have some process of verifying that the person is who the person says he or she is, then what happens? Well, what happens is that you have a very significant risk that someone will vote when they're not supposed to, when they're not allowed, or somebody will vote multiple times, perhaps many multiple times. When that happens, you have disenfranchisement. You have disenfranchisement of those who are entitled to vote. So if these things are racist, then that's news to me. And we've got a much bigger problem with all these industries that I've just mentioned. But of course, none of this is true because this is absolute nonsense. We have the ability, in fact, we have a duty, not we, because we're not the ones who control voting rolls. That is up to the states. The Constitution goes out of its way to make sure that that's up to the states. The states have the obligation, they have the opportunity, they have the duty to make sure that there is confidence in our voting system, and that's why they do it. Mr. Von Spakovsky, H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, not only creates updated formulas for jurisdictional preclearance, but it also creates a new form of preclearance triggered by practices that many progressives fear, loathe, in fact. Now, ironically, these practices are widely popular with voters across the political spectrum.
Right.
Which raises all sorts of questions as to progressives might fear them, but let's set that aside for a minute. Because they are popular, and they're popular specifically because they ensure the integrity and the potency and the legitimacy of each ballot. They include, among other things, voter ID requirements and efforts to maintain the integrity of voter registration files, to make sure that someone who has died or moved out of state or otherwise is ineligible to vote in the jurisdiction in question doesn't vote and thereby disenfranchise those who are entitled to vote in that jurisdiction. How would these practice-based pre-clearance provisions in H.R. 4 ensure that most, if not all, voting jurisdictions in the United States are forced into the even more burdensome jurisdiction-based pre-clearance process?
Well, the problem with this practice-based preclearance, particularly the one applying to the cleanup of voter rolls, is I know the attitude of the career people inside the voting section. Maureen Reardon has talked about it. And they oppose almost any cleanup of voter rolls, any attempt to make sure they're accurate. And you can see this in all the lawsuits that have been filed. You'll recall that a lawsuit in Ohio went all the way to the Supreme Court, the Husted decision. And this,
they're neutral, aren't they? You can trust them, can't you?
Yeah, I think so, right. But here's the thing that people forget about this whole claim that somehow maintaining voter registration systems leads to discrimination. First of all, states are strictly regulated in what they can do by the National Voter Registration Act. It sets out very strict rules on what you can do to clean up voter rolls. And second, this constant claim I hear that, cleaning up voter rolls, taking off people who have died or moved away, it disenfranchises voters. Well, that also ignores the fact that this Congress passed in 2002 the Help America Vote Act. In fact, 92 senators voted in favor of it. That put in a provisional balloting provision. So even if a state makes a mistake, they remove somebody from the voter roll because they think they've moved out of state and they don't. All that person, when they show up at their polling place and they're told, listen, you're not on the list, we thought you had moved, they are federally entitled to a provisional ballot. They simply have to declare, no, I'm eligible, I was registered. They are given a provisional ballot. Election officials then investigate, and if a mistake was made, their ballot counts. So people are not going to be disenfranchised even if a mistake is made.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired. I've got one follow-up question I'd like to ask Ms. Reardon, if that's okay.
If it's quick, yeah. I should tell the members we have a vote underway right now.
Understood. Ms. Reardon, under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, still fully intact regardless of whether this ever becomes law. Is there any reason why that's inadequate to address these? Is there any argument to be made that the Section 2 violations going on are so rampant, so out of control, as Congress concluded they were at the time of the original passage of Sections 4 and 5, that they can't keep up with this?
I don't believe so. Section 2, especially the way that it has been enlarged to include an effect portion to Section 2, really targets intentional discrimination as well, and that is consistent with Shelby. And so although there's been some testimony here that Section 2 is expensive and it's long, it is certainly within the powers of the 15th Amendment, and it also provides DOJ what it needs, and that is to target areas within the United States that are discriminating, as opposed to making everybody in the United States subject to Section 5 when there's no basis for it. I will say that DOJ, since the Shelby decision, has only brought approximately 6 Section 2 cases, their last one being the one that they filed in Georgia. I would say that's pretty indicative that there's not rampant discrimination within the United States, because DOJ is certainly not there filing lawsuits.
Thank you.
I will yield to Senator Klobuchar for her questions, and she will chair. In my absence, I'm going to go vote, and I'll be running right back, and then if she has to leave and I'm not back, if she...
Clark, I'm going to quote some polls that you probably know exist, but I'm going to quote them anyway. Monmouth, 84% of non-white respondents said that they supported requiring photo ID. 62% of the Democrats said they supported requiring photo ID. That number rose to 87% among independents, 91% among Republicans. So 2 questions for you. How do you square prevailing public sentiment with your comments that voter ID is a burdensome proof of citizenship required, and your words, a bag of tricks to suppress black votes?
Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. The department does not believe that voter ID laws on their face are unlawful. The department carries out its work by looking at the particular photo ID law that may have been adopted in a particular state. It looks at data with the support of experts to determine who has access to the particular forms of ID that are deemed qualifying under a particular law. We follow the facts and apply the law. Photo ID laws are not on their face invalid. It really depends on where that photo ID law has been instituted. It depends on the form of the ID and the kinds of ID that may be permissible on that law, and whether or not there are disparities in who has access to the particular category of IDs called for by a law.
The overwhelming majority of Americans, as according to this polls, support ID requirements. So do you think most Americans support voter suppression because you said it would suppress black votes?
Well, the department believes that our elections should be free from discrimination, and particular photo ID laws or purge programs or decisions to shut down polling sites may have a discriminatory impact on minority voters. And what we have found in the course of our work at the department is that these are fact-specific, fact-intensive and context-specific inquiries, Senator. These kinds of analyses are conducted by the career employees at the department who will look at a particular law, a particular photo ID law, to determine whether or not it runs afoul of the Voting Rights Act or the Constitution.
You gave me a department answer, and that's appropriate, but my question is whether you think these ID requirements that because Americans say they're for them and you say they're a way of suppressing black votes, do you think Americans support voter suppression?
Well, Senator, I think that these polls are helpful, but the department conducts its work by looking at the facts and applying the law.
Let me go on to another question. The Department of Justice recently filed a lawsuit against Georgia's election reforms. Will the Department of Justice bring enforcement action against New York for only allowing 10 days of in-person voting, or Delaware for never permitting early in-person voting? So if you say no to that, if you don't plan to bring an action, then how can you challenge Georgia's Senate Bill 202, which has more lenient provisions than both New York and Delaware?
Senator, I can't comment on pending investigations and if any such investigation exists, but what I can tell you is that the department is committed to protecting the right to vote in every corner of our country. In New York, for example, we recently resolved a matter involving a county that ran afoul of the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act. We're committed to eliminating discrimination, root and branch, wherever it rears its head across our country.
I was very gratified to see that the 2020 presidential election, despite the pandemics, quote, featured the largest increase in voters between 2 presidential elections on the record, with 17 million more people voting than in 2016, end of quote. Additionally, in 2020, non-Hispanic blacks had a higher voting turnout than in 2016, 63% as compared to 60%. It would seem to me that we should be encouraging these high turnouts without restrictions. What about these statistics justify the imposition of pre-clearance?
Thank you, Senator. The statistics that you share certainly reflect a story of progress. But what the department has found is that in particular communities across our country, voting discrimination remains a real and ongoing problem. We saw this in Texas and North Carolina, where the department was engaged in long-standing Section 2 litigation against discriminatory measures in those places. We saw this recently in New York in the matter that I referenced involving violations of HAVA and the NVRA. We saw this in New Jersey, where we recently resolved a statewide NVRA claim. So while there has been progress, we know that voting discrimination remains alive and well in many local, state, and other jurisdictions across the country. And Section 5 has proven to be an important tool to identify and block voting discrimination.
Thank you. I have a couple questions, and as you know, some of us have been running in and out.
Mr. Chairman, do we have an order so that we will know when we're in the queue? Senator Blackburn here.
No, I know who you are. We've met before.
No,
Yeah.
I was just asking if
Well,
we had an order in the
the
queue.
Republican side would
Okay.
determine who
You
they
got
would-
it.
Adopt more stringent air quality standards than the federal standards in place without receiving pre-clearance from the United States government?
Senator, this is not an area that I work in, I suppose, but this is not an area that I work in.
Yeah, what about areas that are protected by the Bill of Rights? Let's suppose that a state wants to pass laws dealing with COVID-19 that might have the impact of restricting religious freedom by, for example, restricting the number of people who may congregate in a church or otherwise. Should laws like that have to first receive pre-clearance before they can be enacted by a state?
Well, Senator, I'm here to talk about the right to vote, which falls to the 14th and 15th Amendments, and Congress has broad powers to enforce.
And I assume you'd also agree that through the 14th Amendment, Congress also has broad powers to protect other fundamental individual rights, including religious freedom. What about the Second Amendment? What about gun laws? Should a state be required to receive pre-clearance from federal officials before adopting gun restrictions?
This is not an area that I work in the Civil Rights Division, but I do know that the right to vote is unique, it's special, and it's something that the Supreme Court has routinely said that Congress has broad enforcement powers under the 14th and 15th Amendments to protect.
Sure, and those broad powers also extend to other rights that people have. Now, I think that it's important for us to remember that our nation is built on this principle of respect for the sovereign entities that our states are, and for the ability of each sovereign state, for the people, through their elected representatives, to be able to adopt laws that they deem fit. Because, of course, the sovereigns in our republic are, in fact, the people. The people have yielded some of their sovereignty up to the states. In other areas, they've yielded it to the federal sovereign. The Supreme Court of the United States has made this very clear in a number of cases over the years, including the Supreme Court ruling in the Shelby County case, in which the Supreme Court of the United States said, quote, "The federal government does not have a general right to review and veto state enactments before they go into effect." In fact, the Founding Fathers considered and expressly, decidedly rejected giving the federal government the power to provide what they refer to as a negative or a veto over any and all state laws. So we don't advocate for preclearance, even in areas surrounding our constitutional rights and the constitutional rights belonging to individuals. You know, if the laws passed by a state happen to violate the Constitution, we do, of course, have a procedure in place for challenging those. They go to the federal judiciary. The parties can litigate those. After, of course, the constitutional arguments are made to the legislative body considering them. If they fail there, they can raise them with the judiciary after they become law. And so we've got to be very careful that we don't neglect this principle of federalism in our lawmaking processes. And we can't do this here. We can't sacrifice this principle even for rights that we consider important, because the sovereignty of the people is also important. But there again, if the states do something unconstitutional, their enactments can be deemed unconstitutional, and the enforcement of those laws and their implementation can be enjoined. Unfortunately, we've had a number of politicians, including some progressives, who aren't satisfied with merely dictating voting procedures to the states. In fact, then Senator Kamala Harris in 2019 proposed using preclearance to usurp state control over regulations involving health, safety, and welfare situations arising in the context of abortion. Ms. Clark, when I hear from you, your remarks and your testimony, and one of the things that I hear from you is that the average American's concern about the integrity of our elections is somehow based in racism. Fortunately, the facts don't support that premise. Now, progressives have tried to label any integrity election protection procedure, such as the laws that have been passed, for example, in Georgia of late, as somehow amounting to racist voter suppression. And yet, these provisions have strong support from voters across the political spectrum, including among minority voters. So can you tell me, Ms. Clark, what exactly is racist about requiring a person to provide a voter ID when participating in the precious, sacred, constitutionally protected process of voting?
Thank you, Senator. So the inquiry is whether or not a particular law is discriminatory, and we won't know that until we actually look at the facts. We look at the particular law at issue, and we look at where is it being applied, and are there racial disparities in terms of who has access, to example, to the limited forms of ID that might be called for by a law. So I think the inquiry is about discriminatory effect and discriminatory purpose.
And I would note that the senator's gone considerably over his time. I didn't want to interrupt him, but I was turning to Senator Klobuchar, and I do that because we
Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you, Ranking Member Langford. Senator Hawley, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the nominees for being here. Congratulations on your respective nominations. Ms. Alicant, if I could start with you, I want to pick up where Senator Langford left off just a moment ago and ask you about these lockdown orders that the District of Columbia held were unlawful. Just to follow up on something, did you have any role in the policy of these lockdown orders in terms of creating the lockdown orders?
Thank you, Senator. No, I did not. The Mayor's Office of Legal Counsel passed those orders.
Okay, and did you have any role in the litigation? I see that you weren't formally listed on the briefs, but I just want to be sure, were you involved in the litigation anyway? Can you pull your microphone a little closer to you? I think I'm having trouble hearing you.
Absolutely, Senator. Yes, as with all high-profile litigation, I was aware of it and I was involved. And as Solicitor General, I make a decision of whether or not to take affirmative appeals from adverse decisions. And I think it is a matter of public record and not betraying any client confidences to say that the district did not appeal the preliminary injunctions in the Capitol Hill Baptist case and the companion archdiocese case.
Do you agree with the federal district court's conclusion in that case that the restrictions violated the free exercise of religion?
In light of ethical duties to my clients, I don't think I can comment on whether the district court's opinion, in my view, was correct or not. I can say, as a matter of public record, the District of Columbia did not appeal those preliminary injunctions.
The Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, similarly struck down restrictive lockdown measures by New York and California in separate cases. Let me ask you this. What do you understand to be the current framework doctrinally for evaluating claims of religious discrimination?
Sure. So, Senator, I think it depends. If we're in the RFRA context, then a neutral law that substantially burdens religion will be subject to strict scrutiny and has to satisfy a compelling government interest and be narrowly tailored to that effect. Outside of the RFRA context, in the cases like Tandon and others that the Supreme Court was considering, they were applying the test set forth in Lukumi, which is that even a facially neutral law can have a burden on religion, and if so, then strict scrutiny is triggered. I think what we learned from Tandon and the other cases, which were the first time the court was able to address the question of how COVID-19 regulations interacted with religious liberty, was that if any secular activity is treated more fairly than a religious activity, that raises the bar and strict scrutiny applies.
So let me come back to the District of Columbia case. Given what the district court found there and its holding, and given what the United States Supreme Court has found in the Brooklyn Diocese case and the South Bay United Pentecostal case and others, what's your? Let me put it to you this way. I mean, do you regard this issue now as settled? These cases as controlling, and you prepared to follow this as precedent established case law?
Thank you, Senator. With the caveat that in the district that RFRA applies, I think, yes, the standard has been set.
Which ought to heighten the protections.
Which is, yes, has heightened protections. But I fully understand that the Lukumi test, which has been reaffirmed time and again from Fulton and then was applied in the context of COVID-19 in Tandon and other cases, absolutely is the framework. It's been the framework, and it's one that I would faithfully apply if I were presented with such a question, if I were fortunate enough to be confirmed.
Well, I appreciate that answer. I've been in the position, or akin to the position that you hold now. I was the Attorney General of my state, so I understand that sometimes, and similarly in my state, I was independently elected, and so the governor and other officers of the state were my clients, and you don't pass the laws. You defend the laws. That's your job, and you don't always get to. In fact, you never get to choose what the laws are. You defend them. So I understand the position that you were in as it regards to your client, and so fair enough. I do want to say, for the record, in light of the Capitol Hill case, the Capitol Baptist case, and the district court's opinion there, I think that what the district attempted to do was very wrong. It was contrary to law. I think that it was unjust. And the district court's opinion, which I've read a number of times now, is very unequivocal. It's very, very strong language. And the idea that you would single out people of faith and say that they can't even meet outdoors if they're masked and they limit their gatherings, but yet other secular, non-religious groups and entities can do that, that's hugely problematic. So it sounds to me like you appreciate that because you recognize the case law that is controlling on this now. And as we've now discussed and I think established, the U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in on this. But I can't let this issue pass without noting that and saying again how deeply, deeply troublesome I find it. And again, I don't blame you for your office for defending the law. That's you're supposed to do that. I'm glad you didn't take an appeal. I think that was the right decision. And hopefully that speaks well about your evaluation of the case. Let me ask you about something different. You were counsel of record, I believe, for an amicus brief on behalf of the District of Columbia and 17 states in the Brnovich case. Do you remember this case? It was on behalf of or in support of the DNC, their position in the Brnovich case.
Yes, Senator.
So that caught my attention because usually, I mean, that case was about Arizona's interest as a state in regulating its own elections, and typically states support other states. D.C.'s not a state, but the D.C. as an entity, along with as its own independent entity, often it stands with other states in supporting federalism concerns. You didn't do that here. I just am curious as to why you felt it was important to lead this effort on behalf of the DNC and the DNC's position, which the Supreme Court rejected. So the court did not agree with your position in the Brnovich case, but just walk me through why you felt it was important to weigh in here against federalism and in favor of uniform federal standards that the Supreme Court ultimately rejected.
Thank you, Senator. The district wanted to provide the experience of states to show that while elections are a matter of state concern, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act does not impose a substantial burden on them. So we were writing a brief from experience, as many states do, to provide context to the Supreme Court of how a particular law plays out on the ground. The factors that we focused on in the Supreme Court were that it is a fact-specific, context-specific, evidence-specific, totality of the circumstances inquiry, and ultimately the Supreme Court did not rule in favor of the party we were supporting, but they endorsed, in the majority opinion, the totality of the circumstances test. So I see the amicus brief we filed as being consistent with the ultimate holding of the case.
Just my time is just about expired, but can I just ask you, do you think voter ID requirements are illegal?
I have not had occasion to consider that question in my 15 years of appellate practice.
You don't have any opinion on it at all? I mean, it's been much litigated. It was at issue in part in the Brnovich case.
No, Senator, I don't.
Do you think it's unreasonable for states and counties to require a form of voter ID in order to vote?
Senator, I would not want to give the impression that I had prejudged any issue were I fortunate enough to be confirmed. And I can assure you that my personal beliefs have never come into play when I'm considering the advocacy positions of my client, or if I were to consider any law that were to come before me.
Well, if that's the case, shouldn't the answer be really easy? Shouldn't the answer be that they're absolutely not illegal given the Crawford case?
Senator, the answer would be that if presented with such a case, I would review the law, including Crawford, and I would apply it faithfully.
But, so you recognize Crawford as good law and controlling?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I might have some more questions for you on that. I'm sorry, Mr. Howard and Ms. Nodi, that I did not get to you. You probably aren't sorry. But congratulations also on your nominations. I'll have some questions for you for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. The nominees have filed responses.